Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the TLDR News Podcast. I'm joined today by Rory Taylor, writer, and Zac Rory, our editor-in-chief.
Is that what we settled on? You had the little thumb tag, didn't you, the last one? It's just writer.
We'll go with that.
Okay, It's nice and simple.
How are you both doing?
Good. We're back sooner than we thought.
Sooner, yeah. Definitely. We were expecting to do this sort of once a week.
Double episode week, starting out strong.
I think we probably will be doing once a week.
We will.
Yeah.
It's just because there's been so much going on this week. So the main thing today is that the Privileges Committee report has come out. It's about 30,000 words, I think. It's very long. I haven't read it all. I don't know if either of you two have put the time in today to read it all. But, I've seen the important bits. So we thought we'd dissect that a bit and look at what's going to happen going forwards. So do either of you want to just give a brief summary of some of the main things to take away from today?
I've got right in front of me, I've got the main little lines that kind of sum up the whole thing.
Is there like an executive summary?
It does actually. It's very well done, to be fair to them.
If you're going to shoot at the king, that whole thing.
Better not miss. Basically, the committee found that Boris Johnson deliberately misled the House of Commons, deliberately misled the committee, breached the confidence of the committee, impugned the committee and thereby undermined the democratic process of the House of Commons, and was complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. So they kind of found him guilty on all charges, as it were.
The interesting thing here as well is that I think only one of those technically relates just to party.
Yes.
The rest of them are to do with his behaviour in committee.
Absolutely.
Which is remarkable considering that, this is what we said, I think, last time.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned that last time, didn't you?
Yeah. But the committee's come out and said exactly that, which is just that his behaviour in committee is made his punishment so much worse.
One of the things I think is, I've got to say, before actually we get into this, that I haven't read or really been at all interested in what's happened today. So I'm not going to be that informative. But one thing
we'll teach you.
Thank you. That's what I'm sort of hoping for. One of the things I find very satisfying is the last one, which is finding him of being complicit in the campaign of abuse and intimidation towards the committee. And that is just satisfying because it was so obvious what he was doing throughout the entire investigation. You had all of those reports in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail that were nominally from like allies of Boris Johnson or friends of Boris Johnson, casting aspersions on various elements of the committee. And it's nice that they've had the confidence to stand up to that.
Yeah, and I suspect all of those attacks and things kind of made them even more enthusiastic about, putting those kind of things in and condemning those attacks.
One of the other things that they put in the report as well was his failure to actually listen to or engage with any of the arguments put forward by the committee. So in his little rant that he did afterwards, after, he got the findings last Friday, he said something along the lines of, when he said that he wasn't breaking the rules because he was doing, leaving parties with people and he believed it to be reasonably necessary, that was something that the committee and other people pushed back on. But he's still, even in that thing last week in his statement, was still making that same argument that he believed it to be reasonably necessary, that he had to hold these leaving dues for people to keep morale up, as people working long days in COVID, to which, people have been saying for months that nurses didn't get that privilege. There was no exception of that in law. In fact, they specifically said not to do leaving dues, Christmas dues, etc., because they're not necessary for work purposes. The fact that he still seems to have taught himself to believe that he still genuinely believes that was necessary, it shows what the committee's saying. He's not critically engaging with those arguments.
There's quite a good line that they put in the report which says, it's just one of the things they considered. They say the frequency with which Johnson closed his mind to those facts and to what was obvious, so that eventually the only conclusion that could be drawn was that he was deliberately closing his mind. That read slightly weirdly, but the point is, he was, even if he did convince himself that those things were kind of necessary after the fact, it was a deliberate attempt to kind of close himself off from the actual facts.
Is it like that Parliament's prose hasn't changed in 200 years?
I started reading that and halfway through, I thought
it wouldn't
was
pass
going too far.
The TLDR script.
No, it wouldn't. I'd do a lot of editing.
Yeah,
it lends a veneer of credibility to the shambles that is Parliament, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. But all of these things sort of came together to form the committee's opinion that he should be suspended for 90 days. I know last time we were discussing what the punishment might be, and we were saying some people were suggesting 10, some people a bit more out there were suggesting 20 days. 90 days, I don't think anybody was expecting. I didn't see anybody.
I mean, that is a huge amount of time.
No, There's only been one MP before who's been suspended for longer than that, which was Keith Vaz, Labour MP, who was suspended for 6 months. But outside of that, that's the second longest suspension ever given to an MP.
Yeah.
I think someone Paul Flynn in 2012 was suspended for lying to Parliament, and his suspension was 5 days. So it really shows that it's this conflation of all these things together, which has led to him getting 90 days, which is just, I mean, to put it frankly, the balls on the committee for doing 90 days is, exceptional.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious, but we should point out that since he resigned, the 90-day suspension thing is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show how serious they took the what's the word? The contempts of Parliament.
Haven't they instead recommended
that he loses his or won't get a former member's pass?
Yeah. What is that?
Basically, I think when you leave the House of Commons, when you stop being an MP, most people are entitled to a former member's pass, which means they can access the estate fairly freely rather than needing to be a guest of someone or something. Yeah. So they're going to recommend that he doesn't have that, which is it's kind of like a bit of a kicking him while he's down type thing. But
it's quite sassy.
Yeah, but for a former prime minister to not actually have access to the parliamentary estate, that's quite something.
Yeah, that's quite wild.
But that recommendation is actually what they're going to vote on Monday, I think. I mean, they vote on kind of approving the whole thing, but the only thing that
will be important because he's stepping down, so 90 days means nothing to him. I mean it's such a huge punishment from the committee, and no one was expecting it to be that big. And as I say, I think it just goes to show that his behaviour in committee is led to this more than his actions in Partygate itself.
They did actually point out, I think I read that even before all of the way he treated the committee, their conclusion was to suspend him more than the 10-day threshold anyway. So even if he went along with it, politely and properly, I think he still would have faced a by-election or a recall petition, but obviously not 90 days.
So the next big event in this is Monday, which incidentally I think is Johnson's birthday. That he's facing this vote, which is it will be exactly 3 years from the event for which he was fined.
The birthday cake.
Birthday cake, yeah.
Wow.
That they'll be voting on his punishment for that, which seems apt.
Wow.
So they're voting on that. What do we think is going to happen? Because it's the whole House voting. The Conservative Party has announced it's only a one-line whip, so MPs can vote whichever way they like without fear of repercussion. The Boris contingent will probably try and push back. We've seen people like Simon Clarke today come out and say that, parroting Johnson lines of it being a kangaroo court, that kind of thing. We have heard those kind of things before, though, that there's going to be some big Boris contingent defending him, and that hasn't actually come to fruition.
Yeah.
So do either of you think that there is going to be a big pro-Johnson camp that's going to vote down this sanction, the punishments on him? Or do you think it's going to be approved by the House pretty easily?
I mean, it'll definitely be approved, but it's about the size of the rebellion, I guess. I think there'll be some Tory MPs who abstain because they think Johnson obviously acted poorly, but they might think the 90-day thing is a bit too much, so they might just not cast a vote. But then the actual Johnson allies are the ones to watch, but there's just not enough of them to actually make a difference.
Yeah.
But I guess it does give you a sense of the split within the party and the size of the kind of factions based on the result.
I think that's going to be the interesting thing, is I think that this is going to be used as a way of looking at just how fractured the Conservative Party still is. In the last few months, we've seen, a hell of a lot of conversation about, the rift that has been opened up by Sunak and Johnson, and then there's the Truss camp for a while, how fractured the Conservative Party is. And I think that this is going to be another test to see whether Sunak has managed to unite the ship a bit more. I think ultimately, as you say, there will be a rebellion, but I think it's going to be very small. And I think ultimately it's going to show that Sunak has managed to bring the party together to a large degree, and there just isn't as many Johnsonites left as there once was.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I also think Sunak is lucky in that this is a really inopportune time to demonstrate your support for Johnson. Like, even if you are sort of like soft Johnsonite and you're sort of wavering between the two of them, you don't want to come out, you don't want to express your support for Johnson via this vote, because implicit in voting against the suspension is a sort of like a disrespect for the Privileges Committee. And so I think that even those sort of middle ground Tory MPs who are sort of caught between Johnson and Sunak will probably err on the side of caution. and will either abstain or vote for the suspension, which is great news for Sunak. It just lends momentum to his unification effort.
And he can really separate himself from the Boris Johnson era by doing that as well.
I also think Tory MPs have just been reminded of quite how chaotic the Johnson era was and could be if it returned.
Yeah.
You know, like this last couple of days have been just truly chaotic on every level. I mean, the whole like the Nadine Dorries not leaving Parliament, getting a weird text from Johnson, then, you know, whatever, no one actually knows what's happened, but this whole like shenanigans has been pretty stressful for Tory MPs.
Yeah.
And also the way that Johnson's reacted again, like, you know, that's sort of like
he seems to have stepped up a notch, because people have always slightly compared him to Donald Trump in cases, but I used to think that was a slight, you know, there was quite a big gulf between them. But in the last few days, he's really has the whole kangaroo court thing is really quite Trumpian.
It's really interesting because I think that often when you talk about Johnson and actually Trump and all of those characters, like the term populist covers a lot of ground there. But I think that description is maybe slightly erroneous. And like Johnson has really traversed the populist terrain over the years. Like he starts off on the fun side of populist. You know, you're thinking, have I got news for you? London Mayor Johnson. He's a buffoon. He's the Berlusconi side of populist. And over time, he's just sort of tended towards the angry side of populist, like the Donald Trump side of populist.
The ones that vocally criticise democratic institutions.
Yeah, and like Berlusconi's a bit more subtle and he's a bit more fun, you know? He's all bunga bunga. And that was what sort of 2012 Johnson was. And it's quite tragic, actually, I think, in a way, to watch his transition towards angry populist. Not least because it's just like he's clearly unhappy. I don't want to go West's politics and psychoanalyze him, but like, you know, it's quite odd to just think back to London Mayor Boris Johnson and just psychologically quite how different he is to the current iteration of Boris Johnson, which is just a far angrier thing.
It's remarkable as well, because in that statement he made after getting the provisional report last week, it almost comes across that he just cannot believe that this group of people could find him to have lied in any way. He believes it comes across like he genuinely believes that he thinks that his arguments hold water, that he had it all sorted, and it makes no sense that they found him to have lied. And it, you know, one of the good examples of this is, you know, what I said earlier, that you know, he thought it was obvious that you should be able to have parties for people leaving and that it was necessary to keep the morale up and everything. And he finds it insane that the committee can see it any other way. And it's this sort of like, if they don't see it his way, then the whole committee must be wrong and all of this. He cannot be wrong in this situation. And
it's very Trump, less Berlusconi, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, as I say, the committee mentioned this about the attacking the democratic processes, and I think that's exactly right. The way that he's treated the committee is an attack on that democratic process.
Yeah.
And the fact that it is headed by Conservatives, it's a Conservative-controlled committee, as all committees are at the minute, because it reflects the composition of Parliament.
There's a whole appendix in the report that basically answers all the questions like that effectively were posed by Boris Johnson about how fair and how just the committee was, and they go through and say, you know, the whole House of Commons referred this case to us, including Conservatives. You know, the makeup is mostly Conservative on the committee. They just kind of go through one by one and say, you know, this is why it is fair. This is why, you know, what he said isn't the case. His latest way of discrediting the committee is the whole Bernard Jenkins thing.
Yes.
Which is interesting because it also involves birthday cakes and lockdown.
Do you want to briefly
parties.
Explain this?
I'm not fully up to speed with the latest on it, but yesterday I think Guido Fawkes released a thing about how basically accusing Bernard Jenkins, who's basically the top Conservative on the committee, the Privileges Committee, they said that he broke lockdown rules back in 2020, I think, by having a little birthday party for his wife in Parliament or something. I don't know the exact details, but so they're now saying, you know, if that's the case, it should not be right that he could pass judgment through the committee on Boris Johnson for doing these things, ignoring the fact that the committee wasn't actually establishing whether Boris Johnson was breaking the rules or not.
No.
That had been established. They were trying to establish whether he misled the House of Commons.
Yeah, that's the key factor there. It's not whether he broke the rules or not. It's to do with whether he misled the House, which, you know, in Parliament is can't do that. It's that's sort of rule number one, is you cannot mislead the House of Commons.
I was just going to say, it's really interesting on that point. It's quite how divorced the right-wing media is from public opinion at this point. Because the right-wing media has always been a big fan of Johnson. Like the Daily Mail was his number one fanboy back in sort of 2019. But at the time, they had some sort of claim to legitimacy there, because they were, especially in the Brexit days, for example, they were articulating something that was widely felt amongst the British public. Back in the Brexit days, when Boris Johnson was like fighting against Parliament, and we had all those headlines like, whatever it was about the judges. Do you remember that thing with Daily Mail? And talking about how Parliament was obstructing the will of the people and all that sort of thing. Sure, the language was inflammatory, and sure, it was populist in a sense, but it was articulating something that was really felt amongst a significant fraction of the British public. But now, 3-4 years on, whatever we are, the right-wing media is still defending Boris Johnson with the same fervour it did back then, but there's just no appetite for this in the British public. The fact that, like, I think the Daily Mail or the Mail on Sunday headline was something like a lion fighting for its pride or something stupid like that. It's really, really fascinating, like, quite how much they're willing to sacrifice in terms of their own legitimacy for Johnson. And I just don't really understand it.
I think it reflects the attitude of the right-wing press in this country, that they do believe that a Johnson comeback could happen at some point. And
historically, the right-wing press have actually been, in the UK, the tabloid press at least, have actually been pretty good at basically following public opinion. They pretend that they direct it, but actually they're pretty good at following it. I think that's, for example, why they were relatively keen on New Labour, is because they knew which way the wind was blowing, and they just wanted to get there before it looked desperate. And if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have expected something similar. I would have expected the right-wing press to realise that Boris Johnson is not making a comeback, and that supporting him is really a fool's game at this point, and it just makes them look silly to even the majority of their readers at this point, because I don't think that even Daily Mail readers want, at least the majority of Daily Mail readers want a Boris Johnson comeback, given how unpopular he is.
Do you think they're preempting the fact that Sunak's going to lose the next election and then he might be ousted and Johnson might come back then? Do you reckon they're looking that far ahead in backing Johnson, assuming that this comeback might happen following a downfall of Sunak?
So no, that might happen. But I think the most plausible explanation is just that the British journalistic class, I shouldn't be saying stuff like this, but the British journalistic class is just too inbred. Like, they are just all too, like, Macy with
metaphorically,
obviously. Yeah. Like, it is just there is too much overlap between the British journalistic class, or at least in the right wing, and their political class, And I think that literally what's happening here is that a lot of people who write articles for The Spectator and the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday are good mates with Boris Johnson. Maybe we'll change the word inbred in the cut. Are good mates with Boris Johnson. And I just think that literally explains it. But I think it's really interesting how that relationship where, basically the close relations between the journalistic and political classes, which has served the journalistic class so well over time, is now sort of biting it. What's the right way of framing this? Is now coming back to bite it.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? What I'm getting at here?
Yeah, I do. I think you're probably bang on with that. I think it probably is that they are a small club. They are all probably friends with Johnson, and that probably feeds in quite significantly. But going back onto the point of Johnson, do you think that this, I know we had a discussion about this in the last podcast about what Johnson does now. Do you think that this report coming out and it being as damning as it is, has that changed your minds on what Johnson does next?
Not really. I can't remember exactly what we concluded, but I think it was along the lines of he'll wait rather than, mounting a comeback sooner. I think he'll possibly wait till after the next election. I still think that's probably the case. But I don't know, to be honest. This is one of those things where it's really damning for Boris Johnson, the whole report. But obviously his strategy is using the fact that it is so damning to kind of justify his argument that they were out to get him from the start. That might help him among people who already like him.
It's so Trumpian. It's just so Trumpian of him having consequences for his actions.
Yeah.
Means that he just tries to undermine democratic institutions.
Then we have to remind ourselves that, like, by the time the next election comes around, or as we go towards the next election, people aren't going to be thinking about this, really, are they? It's about the economy and everything else. it's not how many days Boris Johnson would have been suspended for.
I do think it makes it less likely that he returns via the Conservative Party. That's the only thing I'd say, is that I think that this will remind Tory MPs of quite how chaotic a Johnson premiership would be, and B, it'll irritate Johnson to the extent that he'll lose sort of faith and favour with the Conservative Party. And so I think that it makes it mildly more likely that if he does return to Parliament, it'll be via some new political vehicle. There's a bit of chat at the moment about a Farage-Johnson coalition.
That's not going to happen.
I don't think it will happen, but I think I think you're right. I don't really know what's going to happen, but I think it makes it mildly more likely. I think before, the most likely outcome was definitely that he'd be returning via the Conservative Party, after Sunak lost. But I do think this whole episode makes that slightly less likely.
Yeah, I think it's less likely that he'll go back to the Conservative Party. I don't think the alternative to that is.
Well, I mean, in terms of narrative, this lends itself quite nicely to a whole new anti-establishment theme, Bob. It definitely encourages that.
I saw, well, I guess they're rumours, but rumours from people who know about these things. So that the vote on Monday, or the motion on Monday, is going to be amendable, so people will be able to propose amendments to the motion approving this report. There was some talk about Labour considering amending it so that it would permanently ban Boris Johnson from being, being an MP. I don't think they'll do that, and I don't think it would pass anyway. But that would be quite an interesting,
very interesting
thing to do. Possibly would backfire massively if they did try and do that, because I don't think any Conservative MP would want to permanently ban him from Parliament. One on the subject of the actual punishment. This is one interesting thing from the report. It was unanimous in the end to approve of the final report, but there was an amendment that two MPs on the committee tried to make, and they wanted to expel Boris Johnson straight up without any suspension or anything. They just wanted to kick him out, but that got 2 yeses and then 4 noes from the Conservatives on the committee, so it didn't actually pass. So there clearly was an appetite to go further than that 90-day suspension that they ended up recommending.
Yeah. Especially considering that only on Monday we were discussing, it might be 10, it might be 20, to consider that 2 members of committee wanted to expel him.
Yeah.
And there's been very few, either there's been very few or there's been none, Privileges Committee suspending MPs before, or any committee suspending MPs.
I mean, the people who get, I don't know, I feel like we need to go away and Google it, but I don't actually know the answer. As far as I'm aware, no one's been expelled from the House through that mechanism before.
No, exactly.
That's usually because if someone does something bad enough, they are either shamed into resigning, or they just resign off their own back, or they are convicted of something and there's a recall petition or something. It's rare that it would come to a proper expulsion. I mean, like with Johnson, he resigned before they even gave him a chance. So he denied us a few video titles and thumbnails by doing it.
Even Keith Vaz, who was in the middle of a scandal where he agreed to buy cocaine for sex workers, got a 6-month suspension. He wasn't expelled. Yeah. So the fact that they were looking to expel Johnson is significant.
Yeah.
So the vote's on Monday. So we're doing a podcast next week. So we'll be discussing that, I'm sure, next week. But
cool.
Yeah. So an emergency episode this week already. It's a good time to have restarted the podcast.
Do we do the whole emergency podcast thing like all the other podcasts? We do sirens and pretend we rushed in to record it.
I think the tone of the podcast shows that the urgency really isn't here.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you both for joining.
I'm sure we'll muted podcast, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was expecting it to be more fiery, but I think the sort of.
I mean, when you have a 110-page report to talk about, it's kind of brings things down a bit.
You were surprisingly calm. I thought you'd have a lot of fire in the belly.
Maybe I'm saving it for next week.
Very
that's it. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Regularly scheduled anger. Anyway, thank you both.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.